Drew, thank you very much for coming. I'm so pleased to have Mr. Drew Houston to be coming to Globis. And this event has become possible because of Mr. Hiro Kawamura, who is the alumnus of Globis University, and he is now the CEO of Dropbox Japan. And this time, I'd like to focus on hearing the story about Drew, how he was brought up, and how he has decided to go into MIT, and why he became entrepreneur, and why Dropbox, and what's the vision, and so on. So first of all, I'd like to start by asking you, where were you born, and what kind of childhood you had spent when you were little?
Uh, sure. Well, first, thank you for having me, and thanks all of you for coming. Um, so I was born in New England, so in Massachusetts, so about a half hour outside of, or I grew up in a town about a half hour outside of Boston. And probably some of the more formative events in my life were when, I was a little kid and I was, running around our living room. My dad had bought a PC.
Oh, I see.
So this thing,
How old were you then?
I was probably 2 or 3.
Three.
Yeah.
You were using
So,
PC.
Yeah.
I
so,
see. Okay.
I mean, it had a lot of buttons, so it's pretty exciting.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because So anyway, I started out by playing games,
Okay.
and then I was curious about I want to make my own games,
Okay.
or I wanted to change the games, and so that was when I started to learn programming because
I
my
see.
dad saw that I was really interested, or I was always kind of mashing the keys on the
Okay.
keyboard.
So how old were you when you started programming?
I was 5 when I first started
Five.
programming.
Okay.
So I got a pretty early start. But it was, so this is a PC Junior, so it had BASIC on it. And then my dad taught me how to write some of my first lines of code, and so I could do, I wrote some really great software back then, like programs that would ask me like, how old are you? Or what is your favorite color? And things like that. And so, commands like input and print. So that was where I got my first start, and then I stuck with it, and I got some, and I got some of my first job was I was babysitting. So when I was like 10 or something, but then I
see.
eventually got a job programming because when I was in junior high school, I had signed up to test this online game, and I got kind of bored because they weren't developing the game fast enough. And I started poking around under the hood, or I was looking, I tried to figure out how the game worked because I was curious, and I found all these security problems. And so I started to misbehave a little bit. And so I'd like sign in as the CEO of the company and things like that. And then I emailed them. I'm like, hey guys, there's some things you should do a different way, and you should do this way, and this way. And then they responded like, hey, those sound like some great ideas. Do you want to implement them? Do you want to work at this company? And they were in Colorado, which is pretty far away. So I couldn't,
Oh, I see. Okay.
I couldn't move out there.
Sure.
But this was, we would just chat all the time. So I basically started working for them over the internet.
When you were 10?
No, I was 14.
Yeah, 14. Okay. Okay.
I don't know. I didn't plan this out. This sort
I
of all
see.
just happened.
So you were earning money when you were 14.
I thought I was going to earn money. So I had got my first experience with startup stock options.
Oh, okay.
And I learned a few times that most of the time they're not worth anything. And so this was the first time I had that lesson.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But it was fun. So I signed up to be, I did some programming on this game, and I had to. My dad had to sign all the paperwork, and I had to tell them that I wasn't 18 yet. So there's some legal issues with being
I see.
that. But that was then that allowed me to get my first programming job. That was in a startup near Boston. So that was when I got that was sort of the path that led me into working on a bunch of startups.
And then you went into MIT. And what did you major? And why MIT?
So I chose MIT because I was interested in computer science, and that's what I studied. And so I worked really hard and studied really hard for my SATs, which actually we can come back to. And managed to get in. So I was excited because I thought, or MIT has a really great reputation for computer science, and there were some other connections. My grandfather, my dad's dad, got a PhD from MIT.
Oh, I see.
And
Okay, sure.
my dad is an electrical engineer, so he suggested that if I was really interested in computer science, that I go to MIT.
And what did you do? Like I heard that Dropbox is not your first adventure. Like you did something else before.
Yes. So during school, during the summers, I was still working at the same company where I had worked in high school.
Okay.
MIT actually makes it pretty easy for you to take a year off. And so I was excited because I was either, what's a long story, but I was either going to spend a year and go study abroad in France, or I was going to take a leave of absence and work for a startup. And what happened was I actually ended up starting my first company.
Okay.
And my first company, I mentioned the SAT, so it's,
Oh, I see. That's right.
I'm sure probably all of us in this room have had the joy of studying for various standardized tests. What happened was, the SAT in the U.S. is one of these standardized college prep tests, and at the time I hated the fact that you had this like 800-page book, and you had to like fill out all these practice tests and grade it yourself, and my parents made me go to these classes and show up at 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and to learn from someone else who was reading out of another 800-page book, and I was like, this is stupid. Like we should just this should all be online because then people can study at their own pace. And there were some tricks. Instead of like making flashcards for all the vocabulary, I made software to do that, and it made a huge difference. So anyway, long story short, I started an online SAT prep company with a former teacher from my high school who had he had a pre-existing SAT prep company that he ran out of his living room. But anyway, that was my first experience as a founder.
How old were you then?
I was 21.
21, and you took 1 year off.
I took a year off.
Oh, I see. And how did it go?
It went okay. I mean, as these things go, now when I look back, I would do things completely differently. But it was one of these things where we started it out of a living room, and we didn't raise any money, so we were what we call bootstrapping. So we just we only could spend what we had from our cash flow or what our customers would pay us. And it was parts of it were great because it then forced me to learn all these things about business. But there were parts that were kind of stupid, like because we weren't making a lot of money, so we didn't want to hire people. And so I would be in my room, like writing math questions.
I see. You were alone, or you didn't?
I had a
have any
co-founder.
team?
I had a
Oh, I
co-founder
see.
for my
Only
first
one
company.
co-founder.
Yeah.
I see.
And the company was called Accolade. But it was a great kind of first company experience. But I learned that, at some point, I don't know if any of you, I'm sure some of you have taken the SAT, but there's so many, you can only tolerate writing so many questions about parallel lines, or like the Pythagorean theorem, or like, the train that leaves one town at one time and the train that leaves the other town. It's like, so if any of you have any questions about the SAT, I can tell you all about it.
But you spent 1 year working on it, and what happened afterward? Like you went back to school, or?
So I went back to school. So I was then, so I was finishing up my degree, and but I would work at night and on weekends on the company.
Okay.
But eventually I got like really restless because the business is seasonal, right? People don't take the SAT all year round, and hopefully, if for any of you that have studied for it, you hope to only take it once, and so we'd have these long cycles over the spring and fall, and where nothing would really be happening, or we'd be continuing to develop the site, but it was just slow, and we didn't raise any money, and we didn't hire people, so if we weren't efficient, so if we wanted to do our taxes, most of the time you hire an accountant who actually knows how to do taxes. But what my co-founder and I would do, like, flip a coin, and one of us would then go on the weekend, go to the public library and read the tax code and fill out all the forms ourselves. Because if we actually hired an accountant, we wouldn't be profitable anymore.
I see.
So it was things like that,
I see.
which were kind of things we learned the hard way. But it was really, I mean, as far as the company didn't make a lot of money.
Sure,
it was profitable. It sort of, but I could probably, when I add up all the hours I spent on it, I probably would have.
So you went back to school, you finished your degree,
Yes,
and you graduated.
I graduated.
And you graduated, you didn't work for any company.
Well, no, I graduated, and then so there were a lot of things happening at that time. But I was moonlighting, or working on my company at night. But then I had also gotten involved with another like a network security startup in Boston.
Okay, you
in
started.
Cambridge.
The
I didn't
second
start. No, I was working as an engineer.
Oh, I
there.
see,
So I had a
okay.
lot going on. I was working as an engineer during the day. I was working on my SAT prep company at night.
Okay.
But I was getting kind of burned out on the SAT
Sure,
prep thing.
sure. And then?
And that. So I was getting frustrated because I was getting bored of just writing all these math questions, and so I started finding these distractions. And one of them was I don't know if any of you have played online poker, but I got really interested in this, and people thought the online poker sites take all these measures to keep it secure because. And they were like, it's not possible for anyone to, program, like create a poker bot, which would give, something like that would be pretty valuable if you could do it. And I'm like, I bet I can do it. And so, a poker bot is one of these things where, instead of you having to sit at your computer clicking your mouse, you have a computer do it for you. And so I started making one of these things because I had a background in security and I was able to break some of the security measures there. And then I just got obsessed with this problem. And like it was in the summer and my parents would want me and my little brother and little sister to come up to New Hampshire because we had a little house on a lake and we're supposed to get away from technology, but instead I pull up in my car and I've got like my computer and like 3 monitors, and I'm putting all this stuff in the middle of the kitchen or in the dining room. I'm putting all these computers and stuff, and my mom was like, "What are you doing?" She thought I was going to go to jail, anyway, I'm working on this poker bot, and I was sort of revitalized because like suddenly it was like really effortless. It felt like really easy for me to work on this thing because it was a really interesting problem and a really interesting technical problem. Unfortunately, that didn't make a lot of money either because when you're developing a poker bot, basically what happens is instead of you playing the poker and losing all your money, you watch as your poker bot has bugs and clicks the wrong things and loses all your money for you. So it was about break even, and then poker became kind of more illegal in the United States. And I was getting a little bit better about thinking about markets and things like that. And so I'm like, okay, even if I had a poker bot playing it, I didn't want to cheat. I didn't want to have two players at the same table. But I'm like, okay, even if I had a virtual player at every table in the world of every poker site, ignoring the fact that I would probably break a lot. I'd break a lot of laws doing that. But it wouldn't actually make that much money.
So then you found a business about Dropbox.
Well, right then around that time, I was still working on the SAT prep company, but I kept sort of I don't know if how many of you are technical, but sort of the longer version of the story is I had all of the SAT prep companies. Information I kept on this little thumb drive because I needed to work across a bunch of computers. And these were big files. So this was like a virtual machine, for any of you know about these things. And it was like this 3 gigabyte file.
USB drive.
Yes, yeah, that I would put on this USB drive. And so I was searching online there were supposed to be, the idea of online storage has been around since my parents were kids. So it's not like a new idea. But I tried all the stuff that was out there, and it drove me crazy because nothing really worked, and certainly nothing worked with a 3 gigabyte file. But anyway, so I was, you know, and I was having all these problems because my co-founder and I would be emailing each other Word documents, and we'd keep screwing it up, or I'd do work on something, but then realize that he had sent another email with an updated version, and I'd have to like redo all my work. You know, I'd be like, I would have to go to the computer store to buy a bigger hard drive to back up my other hard drive, and you sort of sit back and you're like, you know, you're typing in your own name into an email, and you know, putting in a file, and you think about the real world equivalent of that, like writing your own name and address on an envelope and putting something in there and like putting it in the mailbox and having it come back to you. It's like, there's no question for which this is the right answer. So anyway, all these frustrations, all the things we used to have to do, right? And eventually I'm just like, okay, I forgot, well, there was a time when I was taking this bus ride and I wanted to get a bunch of work done and I forgot my thumb drive. And this was like a 4-hour bus ride. And this was in the days before the iPhone. So if you don't have anything to do, like you really don't have anything to do. And so what happened was I rushed to get on the bus. I opened up my laptop. I realized I forgot my thumb drive. You know, and I'm sure some, you know, many of you have had this experience. You're not like, oh, I hate my thumb drive. You're like, oh, I hate myself. I'm so disorganized. I keep doing this. Like, and then eventually I'm like, okay, I don't want to just spend the next 4 hours just sulking. Like, and so I opened up the editor and started writing some code. Because I had had this problem so many times, and I'm like, okay, someone's got to fix this.
Sure.
So I had one customer in mind in the beginning, which is me. But you know, as I can talk about, it was very clear. I mean, having started my previous company, having worked at a bunch of startups, it was pretty clear that this was a problem that at least some people would have, but never would have had any idea what this would become.
What was different between your startup of SAT and Dropbox? How did it become so successful this time?
Well, I think there are things in your control and things outside your control. And we were really fortunate that this went from a problem that only, you know, the problem with the start was not like a common problem. Like most people had like one computer, like one laptop, right? But as soon as the smartphone comes around, suddenly everybody has 2 computers. So this went from a problem that few people have to the problem that everybody has.
Sure.
So the market got a lot bigger, and there are other things like, you know, the broadband speeds got faster, et cetera, et cetera. But nobody had really solved this problem in a good way.
Okay.
And then another thing that was happening as I was working on the PokerBot is I had one of my best friends from MIT started a company, and this was around 2006, about a year before I started Dropbox. And he raised money, or he got investment from this group called Y Combinator, which probably some of you have heard of. It's this really early stage, it's a sort of a startup that creates startups. So it's this incubator that's funded several hundred companies at this point. But he got into Y Combinator, and so he had some money, and suddenly all these other angel investors were interested in what he was doing.
Okay.
And then he moves out to California, and so he left me behind.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And suddenly I get this phone call from him a few months later. He's like, hey, Drew, I have some news. And I'm like, what's that? He's like, Vinod Khosla, who's he founded Sun Microsystems, very famous venture capitalist, is going to give me $5 million.
Give you?
Not me, no, him.
Give him, I see. $5 million. Wow,
I'm like, yeah, that's what I said. I'm like, no one is giving me $500. Maybe a couple parents, but and this sort of like was like a reset. I'm like, oh man, like what this? What I am, whatever lane of traffic he is in, I am stuck somewhere else. So and then you know there's a whole ecosystem in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, and you know he was just learning. It just felt like he was just having a much faster learning experience, making a lot more progress. He made more progress, it felt like, in 3 months than I had in 2 years. And so, you know, in the back of my mind, I was looking for something that could be really exciting and something that, you know, I get really excited about things like distributed systems and algorithms and all the things you study in your computer science curriculum, and I was not putting a lot of those to work with my SAT prep company. So I was searching, whether I realized it or not. I was searching for something that would have like a really hard technical problem, and then found it just with my own frustrations.
I see. So then you went into get funding from Y Combinator, or you didn't get any funding from venture capital in Boston area?
So what happened was a couple months after my friend Adam moved to California, I had this problem with the thumb drive, and I started writing a prototype. And so I was just doing a lot of coding, and I was applying to Y Combinator, but I didn't. They were complaining that I didn't have a co-founder. Especially at this time, they were just not interested in funding solo or single founder companies, because they believed, or through their experience, the companies that do the best were ones that were teams. And so then this was a problem for me, because the application deadline was like a couple weeks away.
Okay.
So it's like saying like, hey, you need to get married, but you need to get married in the next 2 weeks.
Okay.
So, and that's a long story of how this kind of worked itself out. But so I spent some time visiting Adam in California, and I met a lot of the other Y Combinator founders that were his friends. And I was just complaining to anyone who would listen that I needed a co-founder, because I had a lot of smart friends from MIT, but they weren't willing to quit their job, or they had something else going on that was in the way. And so ended up through one of a different friend I had met at MIT was introduced to my now co-founder, Arash, and it's kind of an interesting story. So we get, and another thing that I did at that time was I took a video of my prototype and put it online. To sort of just get some early, just to get an early idea of like, is this even worth doing? Because, rewind, like I had no idea, this was just yet another side project. And I had a perfectly good job as an engineer at a company that was doing pretty well. So I wasn't really in a hurry to like quit my job, and my parents would probably get upset and all this stuff. And so I wanted to test the idea before really jumping into it. But it turned out that Arash had seen the video that I had put together, and so he had already started getting excited about it.
I see. Okay.
And then we were introduced. We hung out in the like a cafe in the student center at MIT for like an hour or two, and then he got excited. He's like, "Okay, let's do this." And I'm like, "Well, you haven't graduated yet." He's like, "That's okay. I'll just drop out tomorrow." And it's kind of a weird thing. You don't, and then I don't think either of us realized that, like, oh yeah, we'll spend an hour or two together, and then it's like getting married on the first date.
I see. That's good.
So it's really, and I mean, he's a really amazing person, and so you talk about things outside of your control. I was very lucky that I had, that we ended up being a really.
And they get funded by Y Combinator.
Then
how much did you get funded?
So we got $15,000.
Okay, $15,000 for what's the percentage of the company?
It was about 6% of the company
6%.
at the time.
Okay.
So, and we were very excited about that because when your company is just an idea, it's not really worth anything. So $15,000 was $15,000 more dollars than we had, and so because I was also putting a lot of using my credit card to fund all the servers. And so we do Y Combinator, and then that's 3 months, and then we do this thing. Or Y Combinator finishes with this thing called Demo Day, where at the time there were 20 companies, all in the same batch, and we do. You basically give a pitch, a 7-minute pitch. Every company gets up in a row, and they fill the room with a bunch of angel investors and venture capital investors. And sort of another long story short, a few weeks after, maybe a week or two after moving to California.
So you moved after you got funded?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry. So we did Y Combinator in Boston.
Okay.
In Cambridge, and we spent that summer, the 3 months there.
Oh, there's one Y Combinator in Boston as well.
This was when they did it on both coasts.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So now Y Combinator is just in Silicon Valley.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But they were doing it on the summer in Boston, winter in California. But a lot of our friends had all moved out to California, so And I was excited to do that because,
Okay, sure.
you know, I was sick of digging my car out of the snow and all the stuff that that you enjoy as a New England native.
Oh, I see.
And I had never lived anywhere outside of Boston.
Okay, so $60,000, and you started.
$15,000.
You found your co-founder, and then what happened? Like you started your product, and then you start hire people.
Well, so then we needed to raise more money. So we met this guy who was he owned a rug store, and he was a venture capitalist at the same time. This only happens in San Francisco or in Silicon Valley.
Drug store and venture capitalist.
And
angel investor or venture capitalist?
Angel investor.
Angel investor.
So he's an angel investor. Sorry, he was an angel investor. But what had happened, because his rug store had another floor, and he leased that office space to PayPal, and they made a bunch of money.
Wow, that's right. I know that story.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
And he was like he was like a soccer sports broadcaster in Iran, and moved and started selling rugs, and then turned an angel investor.
I see, yeah.
And he ran up to my co-founder, because my co-founder is of Persian descent.
Oh, I see, sure.
So he starts speaking Farsi to my co-founder. And, anyway, so he convinces us to come down and visit him in his rug store. And he's like, let me introduce you to Sequoia Capital.
Sequoia Capital, okay.
And we're like, no. This is like way too early. Because it was intimidating. Like Sequoia is probably the best venture capital firm in the world, and we were like, we're not ready yet.
Sure.
But he's very insistent that we do this, and we're like, okay, fine, we'll take a meeting. But we're not ready yet. This is like kind of scary. But we find ourselves inside that we go down, we get our zip car and go down to Menlo Park, to Sequoia's offices. And it was a little intimidating, because you go in there, and like on the wall is like there's a picture of Steve Jobs, because they funded Apple, and there's like Google's original stock certificate, because they funded Google, and then like there's another picture of like the Cisco IPO filing, and you're like, oh my god.
Yeah, it's a very sophisticated, decent building.
Yeah, it was like a ski chalet.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. And so, but we just explained to them in pretty plain language. Well, I called up a friend of mine who knew a lot about venture capital, and I'm like, help me, I'm pitching Sequoia tomorrow. And he's like, all right, well, here's the things they look for. Actually, I went to Sequoia's website, and they had instructions, like if you want to pitch us an idea, here are the 10 things we care about. And so I made like a presentation that had like 10 things on it.
I see.
You know, and so it was just things like, hey, look, it's 2007, and it's crazy. You know, we have very fast internet connections and great computers and big hard drives and everything, but we still can't get the basics right of keeping our stuff safe or sharing with people. And it's kind of stupid that there's this idea of my stuff is over here, but not over here. In the future, you know, this stuff, you know, and we had I'm sure, for those of you who've seen Minority Report, I'm like, Tom Cruise is not like logging into his Gmail to pick up like the attachment he sent himself that morning, or he's not like, oh damn it, I forgot my thumb drive. Right, he's just up here and just everything. And so like, but that was not the world we were living in. So, and we just kind of explained it in very simple terms. And they got excited about it.
Okay.
So, you know, we pitched the one partner there, and then this guy named Mike Moritz.
Mike Moritz, okay.
Asked to come visit us in our.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, well, that is good. Well, it's good, and it's a little scary, because he's this billionaire, you know, very successful venture capitalist, and so, you know, there's all these stories that I can tell you about this whole process. But anyway, so they say, that, you know, to our shock, they say, you know, we talked to Mike, and then we talked to the rest of the partners, and you know, to our shock, they say, yes, we want to invest.
Okay, that's good.
That's good. Yeah, it is.
How much did you get funded?
$1.2 million.
Oh, I see. For what the percentage?
So it's, I mean, roughly 30% of the company.
30%.
25,
okay.
30%. It's 25%.
I see. That's good. I have about 10 more minutes on my own.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Let me just.
I'll move fast.
Okay. So what were the biggest challenges you faced from 2007 to now?
So recruiting is really hard.
Okay.
And it's hard in the beginning, and it's hard now, because there's this war for talent, right? Great people always have a lot of different opportunities, and so that's still the single biggest thing
Okay.
that I spend time on.
Okay. What's next?
I don't think it's any one thing as much as just it's always, at every step, there's just always a new kind of challenge.
What about the competition?
Well, I think, on the one hand, we've always had competition. So, one of the objections from our first investors are that people don't, there's 100 of these services out there. So
Sure.
actually, at the time, we started working on this because I had tried all 100 of the services and none of them did what I wanted. Because there were backup companies, there were file syncing companies, there were, online websites where you could upload files. But I'm like, I'm uploading my stuff 3 times. This is, crazy. But we had a lot of competition. And now, our competition back then was a bunch of startups. And now our competitors are like Google, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon.
Sure. Amazon.
Tencent, every big company in the world. And so, I think there's a bunch of things we do about competition, and competition is important, and it's something you have to think about, but you can't get too obsessed with it, because, even when investors would ask, like, well, don't you have a lot of competition? We'd be like, do you use any of these services? And they would say, well, no. And we'd be like, isn't that interesting? Because if the problem's not solved, if no one solved the problem, you don't have competition. At least not yet. And that's kind of, and we still think about it that way. It's like, yes, we have a product that does a certain set of things, but when we think about, when you put a photo into Dropbox or you put a document into Dropbox, anyone will just store that for you or sell you some number of gigabytes of space. But what you really want is you're like, hey, now I got all this stuff. The reason I put my photos in Dropbox or my documents in Dropbox to begin with is like, this is how I remember my life, right? Or this is how I get work done, and I need to collaborate with people. And those problems, there are huge problems with each of those things, even today. So that's kind of how we think about competition. And even though people have copied a lot of what we've done, and those companies have a lot of resources, a lot of engineers, we look at a problem where it's there are all these things that are like very broken that nobody has solved. And so, in a sense, that's a big part of how I think about competition. But then, of course, we think about how does our product stack up against all the other ones, and I can talk about our approach to that.
What did you do right and what did you do wrong?
Well, I think picking. We had a really good early team, and we hired our smartest friends from MIT. So we had a very strong technical team, and if you get that right in the beginning, one analogy I use is like your company at 2 people is kind of a seed crystal for what you will be at 10 people, and then that 10-person company will influence what you are as a 100-person company.
Sure.
And our investors, I asked our investors, like, hey, give me advice. Like, when we had some very experienced entrepreneurs who were some of our angel investors too. And he's like, that's funny. I asked the same question to my investors. And I'm like, okay, well, what do you say? He's like, okay, well, here are the top 10 things you need to do. And I'm like getting my pen out. And he's like, hire the best people, hire the best people, hire those people. And I'm like, okay. And I'm asking, I'm like, well, that's odd. Like, what company is like, I hire mediocre people, right? So I'm like, that's maybe true, but it's not very useful. And he's like, well, the talent bar is really important because, this guy had one of our investors, Hadi Partovi, well, it's twin brothers, Hadi and Ali Partovi. They had started a company, and they were telling stories about one day it was acquired for almost $300 million by Microsoft. And we're like, and Arash and I are like, oh, what was that like? He's like, it was the worst day of my life. I'm like, $300 million is like, what do you mean it was the worst day? He's like, well, the company, he's like, the reason we sold the company, or one part, was like, one day I walked into the office, and I'm like, I don't like these people. And like, things are all broken. And, my company's screwed up, and I guess it's my fault, because who else's fault would it be? And I can't fix it. And it was a very sad experience. I mean, it was great. I mean, he was exaggerating a little bit, obviously, and, everybody did financially well, but they did, I think his frustration might have been like, this could have been 10 times bigger. And so, So I think having, I was lucky that my co-founder and I, we have a lot of, there are things where we have the same kind of intuition or same kind of, we care about the same things. And so if you ask either of us about a product decision or a technical decision or a decision about people, I mean, we fight about plenty of stuff, but chances are we'll generally, have a similar idea. And as far as what we want to do with the company, our personal goals and all that, we also are aligned. But we're also complementary. So all this stuff around running around talking to investors or like, flying out to Japan to open up the office, like he does not want to do any of that stuff. He is happiest when he's, in his room at 3 in the morning, sending the Android team a bug report, saying that this isn't good enough. And I'm looking, so the people, there's a few of us from Dropbox here. So, and then he's really obsessed with making sure we have really good people, that people are working well together. He's very internally, he likes spending his time making sure the company is operating well.
I see. What could have done better? Looking back.
I mean, there's, knowing what we know now, there's a million things we could have done better. I mean, I think most of the things boil down to like, I wish we had gone faster in some ways.
Okay.
But, I think part of the challenge is it's always easy to say like, oh, with perfect hindsight that we should have done this, we should have done this, we shouldn't have wasted time on that. But everybody starts out as a first-time founder. Like, at some point, no matter who the CEO is, there was some moment in time where they were a CEO or a founder for the first time, and they didn't know what they were doing. And so you can't expect that you're going to make all the right decisions. So, a lot of what I think about is like, and what I spent time doing is like, all right, well, sort of break down all the decisions. You have to make thousands and thousands and thousands of decisions. Some of them are going to be right, some are going to be wrong. Some you can fix, and some really screw things up for a long time. Right? Some you can't like undo. Right? So it's if you pick the wrong co-founder, you can undo it. You can kind of, but it's like getting a divorce. It's not good for anyone.
Sure.
And so, trying to build your judgment, I think, is something that's really important as a founder. So we wasted a bunch of time on different things. We've hired people who are not, we thought were we were impressed with their title at some big company, but they ended up not being that good. So we made a bunch of people decisions. And me personally, like I think the hardest decisions, the hardest issues are ones involving people, right? Especially as the company grows and what the company needs from its leaders changes. And someone who can be someone who's killed themselves for years building the company and helping you get to a new stage might not be the right person to go from that stage to the next stage. And so they kind of they start drowning.
Okay.
And you have to fire them. And that's a very easy thing to say and a very hard thing to do.
The last question for me is that you are 31 now.
32.
32. And you have a long future. And what you want to do, like what you want to achieve in your lifetime, and what is your vision, and what is your dream?
Well, I think, in the beginning I thought I didn't really have I wasn't like, oh, I need the company to be worth this much money or anything. I was just like, here's a really interesting problem. And the absolute worst thing that could happen is I spend some time, but at least I have this like USB, at least I don't have to carry a thumb drive around anymore. And so I think it's important not to set your sights, you have to kind of have two things simultaneously in your mind. Like one, not stress yourself out and put too much pressure on yourself, but then you have to think about, okay, thinking like a business person, you're like, well, one of the good things about Dropbox is like any company, or every company, every person in the world should be using Dropbox or a service like it. So it's a very big market.
Sure. I think everybody uses Dropbox, I suppose.
I hope so. If you don't download, if you don't, it's free. Check it out. It's great.
Good job, Hiro.
And now, what's really exciting to me is we've created. I never get tired of that. Like seeing people raise their hands and be like, I use something that you guys worked on. And so I think. And something that we talk about within the company is like the 1,000 of us, there's 1,000 people in the company, it's getting bigger. But we solve a problem for 300 million people.
Okay.
That's pretty crazy. Like we're
that's
the
a lot.
first,
Yeah, sure.
and now that kind of thing happens all the time. Right? You can create a company with a relatively small number of people that can solve a problem for like the whole planet. I think that's pretty amazing.
Sure.
And so, you know, we started with, you know, we started with one particular problem, but now, as we have a bigger engineering and product development team, we can do more and more things. And so, you know, what I love thinking about is like, okay, well, you know, as much as, okay, it's good that we don't have to email ourselves files anymore, but, you know, the way we work is still pretty screwed up. And, you know, my photos are in 100 different places, and, you know, all my friends have all these pictures of me that I've never seen. And, you know, when I'm at work, I have like my Dropbox, but then, you know, in offices all over the world, you have this kind of fragmented mess where you have your stuff in Dropbox and in your email and in Google Docs and in Evernote and just like, and we don't even notice how annoying that is, you know. And nobody really designed this thing or nobody's really designed your work experience in like a sane way. It just kind of all sprawled out haphazardly. And so I think about what are the big problems that all of us have that are kind of right in front of us, but aren't solved because to solve them properly would take a long time. And so what my dream is to find these problems that affect all of us, and to continue to build these things that, you know, hopefully hundreds of millions of people continue to use every day, and that really matter. You know, and to be like, okay, Dropbox is the way that people remember their lives, or Dropbox is the way that, you know, has reimagined how we work. You know, to like take verbs and like make them better. I mean, it's kind of crazy. I never would have thought they would have an opportunity to do something like this. So that is really exciting to me.
I see. So it seems like when you were 10 years old, you were fixing problems. The same thing you're doing right now, fixing problems.
I was trying to figure out how games work so I could like cheat a little bit, and give myself 1,000 lives, or give myself the biggest gun or whatever, you know, in the game.
Okay.
Something like that.
Okay, so we have 45 minutes, and we'd like to ask, you know, like to give chances for you to ask questions. Please identify yourself, and please make your question to be short as possible. Okay. Yes. There's a microphone coming on your back.
Oh, good, man. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. I mean, thank you. From a Luddite perspective, I haven't got any technical ability whatsoever. Thank you for focusing on people for most of your talk. And to that point, I'm fascinated by, you said that people are basically the most important thing in the company. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah.
How, outside technical and business history or ability, how do you differentiate real talent from the not so not so valuable people that, you know, people you've had to get rid of?
Well, it's a challenge. So I think the first thing is just, I mean, you know, one of the great things about going to a good engineering school is you really learn what a talented engineer looks like. And one of the challenges when you start is like, you know, you can't really differentiate between a talented business person and like an okay business person, because all you see is they know way more than you, right? And so, you know, especially in the beginning, we would lean on our investors. I'd be like, all right, you know, we need a business development person or a partnerships person. You know, introduce me to the top 10 best partnerships people in the world. And they could do that. And so I think, you know, learning to calibrate and figure out what good looks like is a really important step. And then, you know, over time, we've gotten a lot more specific about, you know, someone might be really great in one company, but not great at Dropbox, and vice versa. And so and Arash and I have both spent a lot of time on this, but he really cares about this. You know, figuring out people that are, you know, really understanding what makes people tick, and like what kinds of people are effective and which aren't. You know, we have like 5 attributes that we look for in people.
Oh, is that right? Yeah, 5.
Yeah, 5, and we have like 5 cultural values or principles that you know that we think are, you know, that we think are really important for everybody to know.
What are those 5 attributes?
So the 5, well, so we have 5 values, and that's the starting point. So the first is, and I'll try to run through them quickly, is be worthy of trust.
Okay.
Which sounds obvious, but we are storing people's most important personal and, you know, work information, and you know, we're trying to build the kind of home for all of your stuff that we would want to have for our stuff, and all my stuff is in Dropbox too. And we want to take care of our users, and we want to take care of the people in our company, but we really care about that, and it's a hard thing to do, but we put it first. Second is sweat the details. So that idea of craftsmanship, of doing things really well, of finding people that, you know, that have very high standards.
Okay.
That's really important. 3 is what we call aim higher. So always trying to push ourselves because, you know, when you start becoming successful, or if you believe everything that you read about your company or yourself when it's too good, then, well, you know it's not actually that good. But you're like, oh, okay, we're good at this now. We don't have to be better.
You could say aim flyer?
Aim higher.
Aim
like
higher.
aim higher.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
And so, like, we all kind of push each other to do better.
Okay.
And even if we do something well, we want to do it even better. So we're kind of very competitive, and we also want to accomplish big things. Like life is short. We want to solve big problems.
Okay.
The 4th is we, not I. So we, not I, which is really about making sure everybody in the company works together, which
Good.
ends up getting screwed up more often than you think, because you know, a lot of people, if you put a big clump of people together, they will tend to start fighting. You know, and then we looked at those 4 and we're like, those are good, but they're very serious. You know, maybe we should. I was thinking, like, why don't we screw around with our team a little bit? And one of our illustrators made this picture of a cupcake. It's like a cupcake you eat, you know. It's like, and it had this like little smiley, like adorable smiling face on it. And you look at it, you just start smiling. And I'm like, what if, you know, most companies have like, you know, honesty and integrity and respect as their values, and we really don't. Those tend not to mean anything. But I'm like, what if we just, for the 5th one, just have that picture of a cupcake?
What does it mean?
Because I wanted to see if people would think it's serious, and it is. But it wasn't the word cupcake, and it wasn't like delight or like don't take yourself too seriously. But we just have a picture of a cupcake, and so those are the 5.
Okay. Okay.
And
Of those 5, excuse me for interrupting. Of those 5, which would be the litmus test? Is there one in particular?
So, you know, those are the values. So that's how we want. That's what we want people to have in mind as they're making decisions. Because you know, in any given day, there's all these decisions that are being made. You know, 99.9% of them are being made by people other than me, or 99.8% or me or Arash. So you want some aligning principles, and then we map those. We're like, okay, well, what kinds of people tend to exhibit those, or what are leading indicators, or what attributes do people who will espouse those values tend to have? And so we want people who are genuine, we want people who are humble, we want people who are audacious, you know, that aim higher part. We want people who are passionate, you know, really love their craft, and thoughtful, and so they're really, you know,
very nice.
attentive to detail. So those are the 5. For us, that makes sense. For other companies, that might not make sense.
Okay. Let's move on.
Thank you
Other
very much.
questions? Yes, right here. And maybe over there. One each. Over here and here.
Thank you. I'm Richard Rowland from Keio University. Hori Sensei, thank you for liking my comment on Newspick.
Okay.
So I must confess I'm a Dropbox user, and I would be grateful if you could upgrade my storage.
I think that's in the works.
But my question is, you just said be worthy of trust. And initially, Dropbox started as a user-friendly, very likable service. And now, as you grow, your reputation is changing. The name of the event is calling you a tech giant. And you've hired Dr. Rice, former Secretary of State. And your reputation is changing. And my question is, how do you deal with the changing reputation? How do you assure the users that you are still the best service that could be found?
Well, I think, you know, a lot of it is, and I can talk about, so Condoleezza Rice is on our board of directors. This was not, so, you know, unfortunately, any kind of political figure that gets involved in your company you know, you get involved, you get pulled into like a firefight that has nothing to do with your company. And actually, you know, this was a business decision, not a political one. And she's an amazing person in a lot of respects. But you know, but I think what you're asking about is sort of broadly trust, and you know, how do you maintain the reputation of your company? And so first, step 1 is like make sure everybody in the company knows it's important. So like that cultural value, putting that first, is like a big signal to everyone that we need, that this little blue box is a promise that we're going to take care of you. And we have a huge responsibility to take care of. We have 300 million people using Dropbox and millions of businesses. And so, it's something that you do. It's not any one thing. It's thousands of little things, right? From our, keeping your stuff safe. We have an amazing security team. We make huge investments there. Through a product that works, and is fast and reliable. I think everybody in the company is involved in upholding that promise. The design team making it so that people can understand how to use the product, and I think that's something that we all need to do as a team. And then, over time, you build up a track record. I mean, the reason why people continue to use Dropbox is because, for the most part, people use it. They find it easy to use, or they find that it, they're free to work on any platform, or that it actually works, or it's fast, or they don't have problems with it. And I think and then they tell their friends about it. And so that's something that we build up over time. But keeping that track record is really, really important.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Kevin. I'm a Grover student. First of all, thank you very much for the Dropbox application. It really helped me a lot. And my question is, for my understanding, for the online storage business, for example, in Japan, already more than 50% of the users is using a kind of online storage. And the pay user conversion rate is about only 4%. And there's so many big players in the market. I want to know what's your idea about the future of this business, and how do you keep the leadership? What is the strategies?
Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of it is by being the best at what we do, and it's about evolving the product and solving. When people store something in Dropbox, storage is just one piece of it, right? What you really want, more and more, what people are going to want is help me share, help me organize this stuff for me, get all this stuff back under control. That's gone totally crazy, because people have to manage a lot of stuff. And so solving these problems in a deeper way, whether that's by, for what we've done, even within the last year, we've added things to the Dropbox app, things like the Dropbox badge, and making the mobile app better, making it easier to collaborate in Office, even partnering with Microsoft. So Microsoft Office actually has Dropbox support built in. And so sometimes partnering with other companies like Microsoft or Samsung. Sometimes making new apps and moving into new areas. So we've been taking a lot of photo functionality out of the Dropbox app, and we created a new app called Carousel, which is really trying to give everyone the ability to have their whole life, right? Every photo you've ever taken with you in your pocket, wherever you are. If you don't have Carousel, go download it. It's really good. It's getting there. And then we do acquisitions to move into new markets. So we bought a company called Mailbox because email got so frustrating for me, and I'm like, this is, in the beginning email's great. Now it's please stop sending me email. Right? And so we think about what are the big problems that are still unsolved, and so and that's kind of how we look forward. But I think our industry. We're trying to help people understand that our industry is evolving, like every industry does. I think you all remember the first time you had a cell phone, right? You're like, oh my God, I can call people in my car. This is amazing. How many minutes do I have? When you get Dropbox or cloud storage, you're like, oh my God, I can have all my stuff with me. I can get to my phone or computer. How much space do I have? Now, phone calls are one of 1,000 things that your phone does. You're not like, oh, how many minutes do I have? You're like, no, I just need the iPhone plan, or it moves beyond just the cell phone minutes, and our space is moving beyond how much, whether you go with Google or Dropbox or wherever, you're going to get a ton of space. So now it's help me do useful things with it. And so recognizing how these shifts happen and trying to be out in front of what people need and out in front of our competitors and be really focused, and you mentioned a bunch of stuff around getting business. There's a lot of puzzle pieces that you have to get right, and so that's why you hire so many people. That's because you got to figure all this out. You can't do it all yourself.
Okay, let's go on. Let's ask a female participant over there in the back, and who else? Maybe one more. Maybe right here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Linda Ding, and I work for Morgan McKinley. And you pointed out that one of the biggest problems you have is finding and hiring good talent. So I'm just wondering what kind of solutions or avenues have you been using in order to solve that problem?
So everyone, we do everything we can. But I think what tends to scale and work well is referrals. So good people tend to know good people. And when when you get someone really strong from Google or from a whatever company it is, then they know who the other good people are, and they start pulling them. You can get them to pull those people with them, and so or they remember, oh, I had this really smart roommate in college, or at my other job there was this marketing person and she was really great. So referrals are I tell all of our new hires that referrals and recruiting are one of the most important things. And it depends on what you're hiring for, and then we also use for our leadership positions, we often use search firms, executive search firms, who help map out who are the best people in the world for a given job.
Okay, yes.
I'm Katrina from Globis. I wonder, because the success of most venture companies come from the complementary skills of its founders. You did mention that you do have a strong technical team, but when you were starting out, I'm wondering, you seem to be the visionary, the creator, the big idea guy, but that's how most venture companies start. But that's also where they fail if they haven't put enough consideration with the revenue streams. Considering in the just past few years, you haven't really built on advertising, which is usually the revenue source of most internet business or online business. So I wonder, how much thought have you put into your revenue streams prior to launching or deciding to kill or nurture your idea?
Yeah, we have what is called a freemium model, which means that most people, anyone can start using the product for free, and if you find it useful, freemium models work when you have some threshold where some percentage of the people hit it, and then to continue, to keep using the product, they start paying. So for us, that threshold has historically been space, but that will evolve over time. And so, it started out on my whiteboard. I'm like, okay, if we have, X percent of people using the product for free, and they store Y amount of data, and it costs us Z cents per gigabyte or whatever to do that, then what would we, how many paying users would we need, and how much do they store, and how much does that cost, and what's the margin structure, and you learn about all these things over time, and fortunately, even just the first kind of dart that we threw on the business model started working. So and it's designed that even with a small percentage of people paying, that those users can cover the rest of the audience, because people that don't use a lot of space don't cost us a lot of money to serve. So that works for our business and doesn't work for other businesses. Another thing that I did was I read a lot of business books because I knew that I was an engineer, but I knew nothing about business. And that's okay. When you're born, you don't know anything about business either, so everybody learns it, at some point. And so, but really trying to think about what do I need to know, and getting advice from people, that was really key to learning the business side of the job.
Okay, let's go on for two more questions. Let's try two. Yes, maybe one over there. Maybe on the back. Yes.
Hi, sorry. My name is Piotr, and I don't know why I think I'm getting feedback. I just left Google, and I'm starting my own business. And I was curious about your approach to people, because you hired Dennis Woodhouse to be Woodside, to be your COO. And also you hired my ex-colleague Arden. Say hi to her.
Great.
So obviously there's probably a tendency to steal some of the best practice from Google, I hope. But what are you trying to do better than they are doing?
Well, I think Google's a great company, and any of these companies that become like really big have a lot of great things about them. Our approach, I think, probably overgeneralizing, but Google's like, all right, we're going to solve all the world's problems through hard computer science, right? And the robots will figure it out, right? Or the algorithm will spit out the right answer. I think we tend to sort of, what we try to do is be a little more balanced between what we try to solve problems with more of a mix of like what we call head and heart, to have a little, put more of a focus on design, understanding people. And it's not to say that Google doesn't do those things, but I think we try to have those things in equal parts. Because companies choose, different companies maybe are design-led companies or engineering-led companies, and we try to hold these. Our approach is to hold these things in balance, and to not have. And to have the business functions be equally valued within the company, or try to make it so that all these different groups work together, which is not true at other places where maybe the engineers are sort of the top of the heap and everybody else kind of serves them. That's not how we do it.
Okay, yes, over there.
Thank you. This is Nobi at Globis University. My question is, how long do you spend the time in a day as a CEO, and how long do you want to spend at the time as a CEO of your company? I say this because you're engineer and you're CEO and want to spend more time to private life. So how do you? I want to know your balance. How long?
I think one of the interesting parts about being a founder or being a CEO is no one's really telling you what your job is. You kind of have to you have to always figure out what you're supposed to be doing. And in the abstract, make money, right, or make good products or whatever. There's a million things that that the company needs to do. So I think, but a big part of your job is figure out, okay, what can I do that will not happen by itself because or what's the most important thing I could be doing right now that will help the company be successful. And so I think step one is measuring your time, and I try to make sure that recruiting is ultimately the way that I can help scale the company. And so I spend a lot of time recruiting senior people that are happily working somewhere else.
Like Google.
And so it took a long time to get someone like Dennis into the company, and Dennis has been incredible, and he's brought a bunch of really awesome people in the company too. And so that tends to pay back and make my job easier, and make it so I can sort of and then over time where you get to once you have a full management team is you can start to figure out, okay, these are the areas where I personally want to spend time. And so over time, you want to design your role so that there's less of the stuff that you have to do but don't like doing, and more of the stuff that you're actually good at and like doing. In the beginning, you have to kind of do everything, whether you like it or not. And to sort of improve that ratio over time. And so I want to get to a place where I'm spending more time on the product and more time, especially on the new stuff that isn't quite that for whatever reason isn't getting figured out quite to the degree it is now. And I want to have more time to think about, okay, what is the things like marketing, and the story of the company, and other areas where I haven't spent as much time today.
Okay, let's go on. Two more questions each. One over here, maybe one, two over there.
My name is Jeffrey from Optia Partners. So I saw you at the New Economy Forum, very inspirational as well as tonight. And from that, I was inspired to hopefully create my own company. But I'm not technical. It seems that a lot of the founders these days are technical. Do you feel that there's a disadvantage for entrepreneurs who aren't technical in the current economy?
Well, I think if you're starting a tech company, it helps to have a technical background. But there have been a lot of great companies that were started by people who weren't engineers. But I think I would recommend finding a partner who is technical. And people are like, well, that's hard. It's like, well, you're a good business person. You should be able to figure that out, right? You're gonna have a lot harder things to do than that. But yeah, I would say, and I think it also helps. It's not scalable. It's not what you should spend all your time doing. But even learning to code a little bit, or just learning some of the basics of design and product development, just putting in that effort and just showing appreciation for it and some empathy will allow you to recruit better partners. Rather, because the challenge that business people have when they don't have a technical background, and they just the sort of stereotype is that the business person just has this great idea and they just need a technical person to build it, right? But unfortunately, like, engineers have ideas too, and they have stuff that they want to build. So, but I would say a mix of both finding a good partner and then learning enough of it on your own is that's the way to do it.
Hi, my name is Utah. I'm a student at Waseda, and I'm also currently creating or filming a documentary about the story of startups in Tokyo. So it's really great to hear your story of Dropbox and how you thought of the idea. My question was, aside from the company culture rules, like the 5 kind of values that you emphasize on, do you have any personal values that you try to live your daily life by? Maybe like 3, or is it generally the same as the company culture?
I don't know. I don't know if I have them. Yeah, I think a lot of a company's culture tends to be, or the starting point, it ends up being like the average of the founders' personalities, or you sort of can see them reflected. When my fraternity brothers from college come by the office, they're like, okay, yeah, they see like a jam room and like guitars and all this stuff, and they're like, they can see how like they see the influence, or how a company like this came out. But so I do think a lot of those values are a reflection of things that I personally care about and that Arash cares about. I think probably most important to me is just to do things that are interesting. And I thought about this a lot when, so I gave a commencement speech at MIT a couple years ago. Because I'm like, okay, I better say something pretty good if I'm. I wasn't planning to get that phone call. Like, what do you do? I'm like, can you just like ask me in like 20 years? I'll be like way smarter. But anyway, so some of the things I talked about were finding. So it's online, but finding things that you can be really obsessed with. That made a huge difference for me. And surrounding yourself with people that push you, and realizing that. We all live for like 30,000 days. I just read that online like 10 years ago. I'm like, holy shit. And I was like, and then I opened up the calculator and I'm like, I was 24 at the time. So I'm like 24. I'm like, oh wow, I'm like 8,000 days down. I'm not like 3,000 days. I'm like almost a third of the way done here. And I'm like, that was kind of a wake up call for me to like just, stop trying to get ready for stuff, check boxes, and more just like try to do something interesting. So those are some of the things that are important to me.
Do you have any routine habits that you do to keep up yourself in terms of learning, or also like making yourself fit?
Well, I could make myself more fit, so I need to do that. No, I mean, I do. It's a good question because I think, one of the things you learn kind of the hard way is that you have limitations, and just as in a car, you can't always have the gas pedal to the floor all the time, or you'll screw up the engine. So I think trying to find, I wouldn't say it's like that balanced. I mean, I spend most of my time working on Dropbox, but that's because I like to do that, and I choose to do that. But finding the things that give you energy and finding things that take away, and so. In things that I've changed about what I do now versus before, I started meditating last year.
Oh, I see. Did you?
Which it's just given me a lot more focused
Sure.
attention. So transcendental meditation, which I thought sounded like some kind of weird cult, but actually it turned out to be pretty useful, and I still do it. It's valuable, and then just a lot of the basics, like, I used to not worry about getting much sleep, or like not worry about the food I ate, or not worry about exercise, and actually like those things are like now in my calendar, like exercise and like eat and like sleep, and I like write down every day like how much did I sleep, right? And so you try to find ways to like hold myself accountable to that, and that's something I wouldn't have done when I was like 24.
Whenever we have some guests who are at Globis, I always ask 3 questions. One was routine habits, and the other one is who do you respect the most, like in your history, or like the people who live in, and whoever you respect the most.
Yeah.
Let's exclude your parents and also
Sure.
your grandpa and grandpa.
So, I mean, when I was little, the first entrepreneur I learned about and was really excited about was Bill Gates.
Oh, I see.
So that's
Okay.
probably not surprising. just built an amazing company that, changed so much about how we live. But I think for me, it's not as I've learned more, I think it's not really about any one. There are things I really admire about each of the founders of the great companies, right? So, I think there are things that we can all take away from Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos, and all the approaches are different. And so I think I draw inspiration. I try to draw inspiration from those are the obvious ones, and then try to find people that are outside of tech, right? So like Bill Walsh, who was the coach of the 49ers, and how he thought about culture, or like the military, or companies that are older, like Andy Grove at Intel. So it's I try to go for breadth, not just focus on one.
What about, do you have any proverbs or words that you like? Proverbs or words like you like a lot?
Proverbs are let's see. I don't know. Do we? I'm trying to think of. Like, what would a really good answer be? So. Yeah. No. There's a little. We had one of those label makers in the office, and I just effing do it. I just put it on my monitor.
What is it?
Well, I'm not gonna say it. But so kind of like a Nike +1, I guess.
Okay.
Aim higher.
Okay, so let's go back to the one, and let's go on to the person with the gray, not gray, like a cream jacket. Yes.
So my name is Carl, and I graduated from Globus last year. I currently help companies from the UK to start business in Japan. My question for you is about the name of Dropbox. Often successful companies have a name that's easy to remember, and I'd like to know how you came up with the name for Dropbox.
Okay.
So the name for Dropbox. So, it was just it just kind of occurred to me, and because I'm like, okay, it's like a container, it's like a place you put your stuff, and then, I was talking. Well, it's funny because this was 2006, like Christmas 2006, when I first started working on this, and the first name of Dropbox was actually Folder Anywhere, and I registered folderanywhere.com.
Folder Anywhere first.
Yeah, that's when I knew I had a brilliant future in marketing ahead of me. So Folder Anywhere, and then I was doing some searching, and I found a problem. There was a company called Files Anywhere. So I was pissed because I had photoshopped this logo for Folder Anywhere. I spent like an hour doing that. Then it was back to the drawing board. But then I was talking to a friend of mine from high school on IM, and I'm like, I'll just call it Dropbox. But Dropbox.com was taken. That's a whole other story. That would take another half hour to tell, so I'll spare that. But then we had this whole process of getting the domain name from this guy who didn't want to sell it. Ended up paying a bunch of money eventually.
I see. Okay, yes.
Hi, I'm Yuta from Space Market. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule today, and I really enjoy your talks. Last year, I was 24 years old, and I heard that you started Dropbox when you were 24 years old as well. And I think for each countries each country has a different trends to do this startup. So I have a question. If you are 24 years old in Japan, and if you haven't started any companies, what kind of industry or services are you looking for? IoT or wearable devices or cloud services or SMS? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on what you care about. What are you excited about? I think, the mistake I made with my first company was I was more excited about being a founder than what I was really working on, and unfortunately, it took me a while to kind of figure that out. And so, I would just think about what is a problem that that matters to you. And sure, all the different, whether that's Bitcoin or internet, that kind of doesn't matter. It's really what excites you. What is a problem that you think you can work on for a long time. And you know, Dropbox, I mean, our challenge is like, it's so broad that like, you know, the challenge, like how do we, you know, stay focused? But you know, people make a big deal out of age. It kind of, there's no like, you don't get, there's no like, it kind of doesn't really matter how old you are when you start the company. There's not like, you don't like apply for a license to start a company when you're a certain, like, it's, so, you know, I would just get started and do something. And it's kind of irrelevant how old you are.
Thank you. Do you have there any advantages to do the startup from Asia?
Sorry, say that again?
What is the advantage you find starting up from Asia?
Well, I think, you know, anywhere we have a bunch of people who want to start, who are like really excited, you know, I think that this conference is a great way to you know, bring a lot of people together who are excited about starting companies. And what are the advantages in Asia? Well, I think, you know, I think there's a lot of exciting innovation that happens here, and a lot of, you know, you look at what ends up being successful elsewhere, or like what, you know, a lot of U.S. companies are copying. A lot of that originated in Asia, and you know, you look at, and a lot of the markets are really big here, right? And that's why we're in Japan, and obviously China is a huge market. That's harder for a U.S. company to go after, but yeah, I think each culture and each country is going to have its different strengths and weaknesses.
Thanks so much.
Okay, let's go for 2 more questions. Let's go for the lady over there and one over there. Yes, maybe over there, on the back. Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm Maria from Waseda University, and I have one question. I'm having internship at a company, and I heard you were having internship when you were young. I mean, you're still young, but when you're more young.
Less young. Yeah, now I have all this gray hair. It kind of sucks.
So, like, what was your goal when you were internshipping?
I was just like, I want to find cool stuff to work on. You know, I was looking for just something exciting to build, because I was an engineering intern, and you know, there's a lot of different things that I found interesting.
Yes.
Hey, my name is Ramesh. There you go. Ramesh from Romania. Whoa, there we go. I wanted to ask you, like, how instrumental was Y Combinator to Dropbox? Would Dropbox be where it is today without having gone for one of these accelerators?
Well, unfortunately, there's no way to run the other experiment. So, but look, it was really valuable for us because, you know, I didn't grow up in Silicon Valley. I didn't have a lot of connections there. You know, we had no experience, no connections, no money. And one thing that's cool about Y Combinator, it's a totally open application, right? So it's kind of like college admissions, where anybody can apply. Very few get in, and so it was very useful because first you have a bunch of other entrepreneurs who are going through the same thing. It's actually, you know, it's a really hard work to start a company, and to have other people that are kind of suffering through the same challenges is helpful. They bring in speakers who are like really some of the best people in the world, best entrepreneurs in the world, best, you know, investors in the world, kind of are now bring them into your orbit. And then it was a springboard to then get funding. So, you know, would it be, I think it sped up a lot of, or made our job easier to go move through the stages of starting a company.
As an alumni, do you still review applications?
I don't review applications, but I do speak. I go back to talk to the founders.
Thank you.
Last 2 questions. Let's go on. Okay, one over there and one over here.
Hi, my name is Aki. I'm a 2015 Growth student. Thank you very much for today. If may I ask, have you ever thought about quitting what you're doing? And if so, what kind of situation, and how did you do it?
Could you please repeat?
Have you ever thought about quitting, stopping, or
Stopping.
retiring?
Retiring.
I mean, you've been going through lots of challenges and difficulties. How did you,
You know, you spend so long building this thing that the idea of like starting over is like the last thing I would want to do. And so that's cool, because you spend every day putting down another brick, and eventually you're like standing on top of what you've built, and you can do more and more. So, it's certainly a lot. It's a lot of work to keep to keep going, and our competitors, don't want to make our job easy. But I think that said, I do get excited about a lot of different things, and so when. But fortunately, the sort of scope of what we do is broad enough when we think about, okay, we're going to build a home for your stuff, or really the reason we do that is to kind of take some of the pain out of technology. Like that's what like when we think about, okay, if we save someone an hour times 300 million people, like it's like lifetimes and lifetimes and lifetimes and lifetimes of pain that we save every day just by like existing. That motivates me, and that a lot of problems kind of fall under that. And so when I get, we started out like with file syncing. But then I got really frustrated about email, and I'm like, all right, let's just change the mission of the company to also deal with email, or whatever. And so you can kind of reframe things in a way that keeps it interesting. And so that has, and I think just having like for me personally, having just like a never-ending stream of more interesting and bigger and important challenges, and sort of doing work that matters more and more, is what keeps me excited about doing this.
Okay, last question, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Fan at NTT. So it's a Japanese telecom company. And my question is, I really appreciate your product because it helps our lives a lot. And do you have any idea how would you help people who are in underprivileged in the future? Underprivileged in the future.
Oh, underprivileged. Yeah, actually, some of the stories. So first of all, because Dropbox is free, anyone can use it, and so we get all kinds of people in nonprofits or in schools, or obviously if it's free, you don't have to. It doesn't cost anything. So, and those are some of my favorite stories. Or when we hear about people who are collaborating using Dropbox, and they're achieving their goals to build a school, or to we had someone who was saving the black rhinoceros in Africa, and uses Dropbox to upload the pictures of these poachers so that you can put them on a website to raise awareness of this problem. Like, that was not the first thing that came to mind for us when we were doing this. And so we get all these crazy stories from the far corners of the earth, and ways that people use Dropbox, which are really exciting for me. And then we also we have a program we call Dropbox for Good, which either, whether that's, and some of that is just like making sure that the business version of Dropbox or the full version of Dropbox is available for a discount or for free for different causes that people in the company are excited about, or it's helping in the community, or just helping in different ways. So we do both, and that's one of the things that's fun is beyond just sort of the building a business, we can use some of these resources and the talent of the team to solve other problems.
True, we have quite a few students and participants here, and Globis' educational principle is to educate visionary leaders who create innovative societies. What would you give advices to visionary leaders who create innovative societies?
Well, I think, just for me, it was just finding things I could get really excited about. And I think there's a tendency to want to like chart out the perfect path before you start your first company. But I think just whatever it is, if you want to start a company, for me the best path or the most helpful things were to join a startup, and I was part of maybe five other companies before starting Dropbox, and so joining a startup and then taking the plunge and don't worry too much if you don't have it all figured out. Like what I wish someone had told me is like it's okay. Like people really you don't have to have all the answers at the beginning. Everybody's doing it for the first time at some point. It sounds obvious, but I think I would have taken some of the pressure off of myself.
Living in Boston and you moved to Silicon Valley, has it changed a lot about your mentality, about your ways of doing businesses and your growing companies, or Has it been so much different?
Huge, yeah. Because we're starting an internet company, and a lot of the best, great internet companies are built all over the world, but a lot of them are built in Silicon Valley. And so, it was a little bit different from Boston in that, as all these companies that we would look up to, like a Google or a Apple or a Facebook, like the founder, I've gotten to know the founders or the people that have built those companies, and a lot of the alumni from those companies now are at Dropbox. So I find that that has helped me learn so much faster than I would have.
Like when you look into people like Bill Gates, and let's say Mark Zuckerberg and yourself, and all of them have been educated in Boston. And how come they have to go to Silicon Valley to get started?
It turns out the schools in Boston don't like that.
I know. Does it mean that there's not enough cultural entrepreneurship in Boston, or why is it there are so many talented people being educated in Boston, and why do they have to go to Silicon Valley?
Well, I think and I tell people this in Boston too. So, and I still have a 617 area code, which is the Boston. I hold on. I'm still a Boston sports fan. I'm a Patriots fan and a Red Sox. I love Boston. But I think for internet companies, you want it's like putting your kid in a school.
Okay.
I don't have kids, but I imagine if I had kids and I wanted to put them in school, I'd be like, I want the school, even if it's just like 2% better, I'm going to kill someone to get into that school, right? So I don't, and then because, and it's like this virtuous cycle, right? So I think the San Francisco Silicon Valley area is today the best place in the world to build an internet company, but it doesn't have a monopoly on innovation, right? You look at there's a lot of really valuable companies that are not created in Silicon Valley. So I think people fixate on this, and for me that was a good decision. But I don't think. And the thing is, it always changes, right? Boston, when there are areas where Boston is really strong.
Sure.
Right? There's like healthcare, and I encourage. Everybody has this kind of envy about Silicon Valley, but I'm like, look, and I talk to the people from these schools, and I'm like, instead of trying to just copy the recipe that worked at a certain point in time for some other place, play to your strengths. Like in technology, new stuff comes along all the time. Right? And so all this new stuff around Internet of Things, or around robotics, or around biotech, like those are areas where Boston has like really great natural strengths. And Japan has natural strengths in a lot of these areas. So that's usually my advice when people are worried about.
Sure, in case of Globis, we started business school and we're educating leaders like Hiro Kawamura-san, and at the same time we have a venture capital, and we are creating ecosystem from Tokyo. And I'm quite sure that your speech today has inspired so many entrepreneurs, and there will be lots of companies starting up from Tokyo, and I hope you will keep coming back and give us lots of advices and speeches. And let's big hands applause to Drew Houston for the wonderful speech today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.